and conflicts. And that's an important thing to kind of actually say. The problems and the difficulties and the consequences in terms of mental health, breakdowns or whatever they were called in the past, suicides, alcohol and drug abuse, isn't new. It has been recorded across human history, and in the Australian experience, certainly in relation to the major wars that we've been involved in at any stage in the overseas deployment situation. But in domestic situations as well, then the increasing reporting amongst particular groups that might be exposed, so people who are in first responders, emergency services, our own personnel that serve overseas and have served in conflict areas, but of course in relation to other areas of violence and life-threatening experiences and very traumatic experiences. So generally speaking, it continues to go up. Now that's important because it's moved from the sort of non-specific anxiety disorders, which generally in our health system are a fairly low priority for care. Most systems worldwide focus on those who most obviously need care. So in most populations everywhere in the world, those who are psychotic, those who are unable to function, those who obviously are so behaviourally disturbed that society has to respond, attract most attention. After that, from about the 1960s onwards, those with the major mood disorders, where I spent a lot of my life, or the major depressive disorders, have generally been the group second who receive some degree of care. Although, interestingly, the majority of those people themselves still don't receive that much care. But anxiety disorders used to be right down at the bottom and more or less ignored, except in very specific situations, war veterans being one. But what's happened over time with the increasing awareness and with this particular specific assignation is to say, hang on a second, these are more specific and not just generalised anxiety in a general sense. And the important implication of that is that they may require very specific interventions. They may not do well just being washed in with everything else that has happened. And I guess it's got a bit more complicated since then of those specific situations like war veterans or specific exposures or specific incidents where people can say there was a life-threatening event or a very dramatic event or amongst particular populations that you might think are at risk, to a more complex set of issues related to childhood trauma, related to other interpersonal events that has become more complex as to what that might mean. But having said that, internationally, one of the important things in the American development is internationally, when we talk about the consequences of war and conflict and violence more generally, not to only see the immediate effect of those things and to think it's all fixed the moment that peace breaks out or the conflict moves on, but the long-term consequences that society, individuals pay for that, but societies they live in pay for that on an ongoing basis is really dramatic. So, for example, I'm tied up in work at the moment in Colombia, which is one of my favourite. If you ever get to go to Colombia, it's a fabulous place. But they've had civil war run for a very long time, and the intergenerational effects there are huge. So when they talk about the biggest mental health issues in Colombia, they talk about the intergenerational effects. What has happened to their society as a consequence of 20, 30 years of civil war and of the breakdown of society and of violence and of ongoing use of violence to try and solve problems, very commonly in the political arena. And in other countries we're told, for example in Mexico, where in fact kidnappings and personal violence remains extremely common, that there are not only immediate effects, but people affected by that, and the society itself being affected by that across generations is large. So I think what it's also led to is not just how bad it is for the individuals and how many individuals are affected, what is the socially corrosive effect, and then what are the transgenerational effects within societies that have not really been counted when we talked about the ongoing mental health impacts or the ongoing social significance. And of course, just come back to our own local situations, and very importantly, recognise the role of Indigenous people on these lands. We talk about in New South Wales, for example, if you talk about the trauma associated with stolen generations and with changes in particular groupings and what has happened, we continue to see the effects in things like our own First Nations peoples in our own countries.
There's a question on that coming up.
And yeah, so I think one of the things why it's also important, why it's so important what you're doing to focus on is to not just count the individual cost, but to see the social cost and the very large costs that communities play as a consequence of their ongoing mental health difficulties that have arisen as a result of war and conflict and of localised violence.
Just quickly, what in Australia at the moment, what is the most common cause of PTSD diagnoses?
So if you go to the population estimates of that, then about 5%, about 1 in 20 Australians every year say they've got post-traumatic problem. They will mainly attribute that to domestic violence type situations or to childhood violence type events. So largely intrafamilial and personal type events. but of course within particular groups within the population. So within policemen, within ambulancemen, within first responders, with those who've served overseas, with those who may have been exposed in other settings, there are subgroups where the rates are much higher. So the overall estimate, which is generally for most people attributed to familial or very close personal events, not random events, things that would usually happen, because an important kind of consequence here, which is repeated exposure to events. So they're generally not just one-off events that have happened, being robbed or being assaulted. They usually got to do with repeated exposure to violence and to trauma and to threat. But we do have within our own society particular groups where the rate is much higher, including obviously those who've served overseas, been exposed to violence on a repeated basis, and continues. We have a Royal Commission continuing to run into veteran suicide, for example, at the moment, which is one of several, I'm afraid to say, that's run over the last 30 years. We also have a lack of capacity to sort a lot of these things out.
Yeah. So just talking about repeated experiences of trauma, my next question is to Dean, actually, and I think, I don't know if anyone here has read his book, but he certainly details... Oh, okay, sorry. But he certainly details, many of his experiences and the impact of these layers of trauma on his experience. But look, I'm interested in your journey, Dean. When you first resisted the idea that you had a mental illness and only sought treatment after your wife pleaded with you to get some help when you became suicidal. So, tell us about that journey.
I think this is a common thing with men, right? Men tend to feel that there's nothing wrong with them. And this is what I've encountered a lot. I can see a woman up the back there nodding her head already.
Lots of people.
And for me, I'd had an international career as a foreign correspondent. I'd covered the Iraq War, I'd covered the Bali bombings, the Boxing Day tsunami, I'd covered earthquakes that no one will remember. And so I'm back in Tasmania and living in the island paradise, and all the symptoms of PTSD start to emerge, and my amazing life partner, Mary, says, there's something wrong with you and you need to get help. And I'm saying, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm still doing a good job as an editor for one of the world's biggest news organisations. What's wrong with me? I'm fine. I'm in a sort of a denial state. And this goes on for years. And for me, it was partly that mental illness was not part of my identity, right? I was this hard-charging foreign correspondent who went to all these events and covered all this stuff and didn't crack under the pressure. So mental illness wasn't part of my identity. The second thing was that it had been years since I'd been in a war zone. So what was going on? How could I be getting sick now? I didn't understand that with post-traumatic stress disorder, there could be a delayed onset. And because I was in a denial state about what was going on, I didn't read about it. So I wasn't open to any sort of education about what the condition was. The third thing was that I just wouldn't, I love my wife and I have amazing respect for her, and she is the reason I'm still alive today. But at that time, I think it was part of my maleness, my masculinity, that said, I know that I'm okay, I'm fine, I'm not going to listen to you. And that went on for years. And as a result, it delayed me getting treatment. And I think it's one of the main lessons in my book.
So it wasn't just PTSD that you realised that you had, it was also moral injury, a term that was something that you associated with a condition.
Yeah, that's right. Anyone here heard of moral injury? Mm. Ah, that's great, interesting. Yeah, so moral injury is similar to PTSD. It's essentially when someone's notion of what's right has been so strongly violated that it can be, for example, you do something, you fail to do something, or you witness something that is so horrific, and it has psychological consequences that are akin to PTSD. Or that there might be an organisational betrayal, deep and lasting organisational betrayal. And in my case, 2 of my staff were killed in Iraq while I was the bureau chief. I failed to protect those men. Those men were killed on my watch. And it took a decade for that to catch up with me, but it did. It did catch up with me. And I felt culpable. I felt responsible for the loss of their lives. And that was my moral injury. And it took me a long time to work through this, but I was able to, with the help of actually a spiritual care worker, not a traditional clinician, not a traditional psychologist or psychiatrist, but a spiritual care worker who helped me plan a ceremony, a memorial service on the 10th anniversary of the deaths of these men. And I was able to forgive myself for what I had failed to do and make peace with myself. And I think there is growing understanding of moral injury, especially in the veteran space, in the first responder space. It's now becoming, in the medical sphere, it's becoming more of an understood concept. And I think it's good because to me it describes the moral dimension of trauma that is not well described by PTSD, which in the DSM-5 is all about life threat, fear and danger. Whereas the moral dimension of trauma can be very, for some people, it can be the real thing that causes the impairment and dysfunction in their life and can ultimately lead to suicide.
Thank you. Now, Viviana, Ian did touch on sort of the collective trauma that is in some communities, but this is something where a lot of your research is around this concept of collective trauma. I know it's trauma is kind of a word that's not translated well into other cultures that do experience trauma. But you know, when you think that there's so many conflict-ridden societies, Peru, where you've done your research, you know, Iraq, Afghanistan, Palestine, Iran, someone here from Ireland, yeah, yeah. You know, often these are very fractured and distressed societies. Can these societies heal, or how can they heal?
What a big question. I think something to understand is that trauma travels with the collective or with the individual. When I went to do my research after the armed conflict in Peru, I thought I was going to do a research about some of the causes that prevent victim survivors to live, to have agency. And I thought the problem was structural poverty, structural violence. Then I thought armed conflict, and then I thought already happened in 20 years. And he's traveling with people, traveling through the years, through the spaces, because most of them leave the place from where the conflict happened. But the experiences, although there is, as Ian say, and Dean, is this sense of denial. So, but it's responses to it, and that response is what is the split, or the fragmentation, or in the human security discourse for the UN is what threats the vital core of people. The sense in the self, and in the community level is sensing that sense of community, that sense of culture. So at collective level, then how do you wield again that sense of culture that is not anymore in the place in where the person, the group of people sense it, that and learned. So it can happen in Australia, a group of, after the Pinochet in Chile, a group of people can move to Australia. So Colombia, people can migrate here, but then what happened with that? And it comes out as individual, but also as a collective. There is a collective sense of want to belong, to still want to belong. And I think one of the ways to heal in a way is how do you find this sense of belonging, the sense of community again. But I think goes farther than that. It is more, if you really think what is your sense of living, it goes beyond just a place or community. Is language, is culture, is knowledge, and all those ways that people manifest their way of living. And all of that needs to be pretty much reconstructed. And as I read this book, and finding meaning again in that new place or in the same place, as a sense of community can be a new community, but that's finding that sense of meaning as a whole.
Yeah. There's a question that has come in from someone who registered, and thank you everyone for, if anyone here has submitted questions. Those great questions, and you will get a chance to ask questions at the end of this session. But here's the question from about Australia, specifically. How can your work, and I'm not sure who this person is referring to, but I will start with Viviana on this because I know that you have done work on the impacts. Anyway, I'll finish this first. How can your work be applied to ongoing trauma of dispossession and colonisation for First Nations people in Australia? Now, you have done work on this, Viviana, is that right?
Yes, as I was saying, dispossession, not just of lands, but we're talking about dispossession of knowledge, let's say, or dispossession of language and ways of expression. So now my work, I was mentioning, we had a small meeting last week, this week, and I was mentioning that I was going to conferences about armed conflict, how it affects women, and so on. And I just felt like I got, I don't know if the word is tired, but I thought, I don't know what my research is collaborating with. This is not going anywhere. And I started to join some communities to become a practitioner of what I should do with. So I thought, okay, so if the problem of what is happening is the way of expression, how can I disrupt that way of expression in a way that people start changing their relationship to the other? And for Indigenous people and Aboriginal people, oral languages have been really equal to illiterate, which have a negative connotation. In South America, in Peru, we say, okay, it's equal of no education, is equal education. But there are several books that express how oral languages actually have a different way of knowledge and expression. So I became part of one group of how can we start engaging students in different ways of expression. And creativity is one, but to acknowledge that original people, encyclopedic memories, that in a way that is not in reading and writing, but in a way to reconnect with that new knowledge in a different way. Mm-hmm. So I think one way healing, it's myself, and it's a way to reconnect. But to try to say, I'm going to go and heal Indigenous people, I think it's not, I think it's, for me, it's time to turn the lenses on each person. What's my relationship with dispossession? What's my relationship with oral languages? What's my relationship with my indigeneity? What is my place? And with that understanding is when I can understand the dispossession of others, and in this case, for Indigenous people in Australia.
Yeah. Dean, now that we've got a referendum coming up where many of these issues of, the trauma from colonisation and dispossession are coming to a fore, I mean, what's your view on the best way to approach or the best way to observe even these issues?
Yeah, having seen up close the collective trauma of a whole country in Iraq, I think there are some lessons that I would sort of take from there, and I think we've got to focus on the storytelling. And that's not what's happening at the moment. Everything at the moment is about the politics of the referendum. And I think if we can focus on the storytelling and the stories of our First Nations people, then that can get us back to why this is so important and why we need the voice. And I don't understand why our media is so... I think I know why they understand why they're focused on the politics, because they think other people are interested. But I want to hear the stories. I want to hear the stories from across Australia about our First Nations people and what is happening in their communities. And I want to be educated and informed, but it's not happening at the moment. And that really saddens me that that's the case, because I think with that information, the case for the voice is utterly compelling. Because I did a podcast with a First Nations fellow several months ago, and it was through him that I learned that Indigenous youth in Australia have the highest suicide rate of any youth population in the world. And it's that sort of information that needs to be, these are the facts that need to be made available, but do it through stories. I'm a journalist. That's how people need to get this understanding and to write the crap that is being disseminated by various parties, because we're not going to get another chance at this, I don't think. Not in my lifetime.
Ian, do you have anything to add to this intergenerational trauma?
Well, yes, I did pick up Viviana's point here about place and about connection, the collective things. And picks up Dean's point about what are collective stories, what are stories that are shared by groups that allow people to connect. One of the interesting things about most mental health problems, but particularly PTSD, is the extent to which people disconnect and get lost in their own head. In a sense, you can actually even look at that in a brain imaging sense. You can look at the sense now to which people are lost in their own head. So they've disconnected from the collective, they've disconnected. And in a sense, Dean's very interesting, just don't want to lose this from his earlier recollection. The problem didn't happen when he was actually over there. The problem was actually back in Tasmania, I think of Tasmania as a quiet, peaceful place. But unfortunately, it's the sort of place where you can get lost in your own head. When actually what is actually in there gets expressed. As distinct from when you're participating in, when you're part of. So both the healing bit, and I think that obviously what Australia has not done is actually settled any of this. The colonial effects of the whole dispossession is unsettled. But it's only seen to affect a small group of people. It's not seen to be a collective story, and the stories themselves are not told. And they're very live stories. They're not stories from hundreds of years ago. They're live stories. They're ongoing stories that have affected generations of families. So I think there is a really important set of issues. A huge opportunity for Australia to make progress on that, but we seem unable to actually connect with that. Even though, I come from an Irish background where families tell stories all the time, and people interchange. I think that's important. I don't think there's a being Irish. There's a thing in my family what the Irish do versus what the English do. The English tell individual stories. I this, I that. I come from a large Irish family where people change. Like the person telling the story just changes. Somebody else just joins in. It's a collective narrative. It's not a personal narrative. It's a really interesting kind of thing, because I think we have cultures. It's a we. We have a background. So it's not...
I do
Yeah, exactly.
So therefore the we doesn't matter. Whereas if someone who is Irish does something wrong, it's our
We're all in it.
responsibility, and that's a tribal responsibility.
So I'm lost in another thing in Australia. People think, are you okay is a great thing. I think actually the question is, are we okay? Not whether I'm okay. Whereas the tradition of individual psychology, and somewhat, and I'm going to blame the English here, sorry. It's an English, because it's an English, is to actually tell stories in the first person, as distinct from telling stories in a collective way and a shared way. And what is so terrible about mental health problems, but particularly PTSD, is the extent to which you're disconnected. You're lost. You can no longer relate to the collective. And the healing, to come back to the issue about moral injury, how organisations and groups behave has a large determination about whether the justification, what is happening, whether there's a collective purpose. So both in preventing this from happening in the first place, but also in the recovery of things. So I think we have a huge opportunity, which we're in danger of not taking in Australia, because people don't feel it's their journey. They don't feel it's a small group of people, 3% of people. Why should we upset things? And a lot of people are sort of basically, well, what happened anyway? Just get over it, move on. So the failure to engage in the collective narrative is at the root of the problem. And we don't have a way of doing that. We don't have I think in a lot of Anglo-Saxon cultures, we just don't have a strongly shared sense of the collective narrative and coping with adversity as distinct from the individual narrative, which is very problematic because when you're lost, you're lost.
I love these answers. That's great. Now we're going to move on to the healing process. Dean, I'll start with you here. You were fortunate enough to have strong support of family and friends, as you've talked about in your book, and your treatment in a psych clinic in Melbourne was exceptional. You refer to it as a multi-dimensional approach, and I'm going to draw from a question that came in with the registrations from Pam Trotman. If moral injury differs from PTSD in that it is not directly related to extreme threat, but to the meaning a person gives to the traumatic experience, then is there a need for healing programs to focus on the emotional and spiritual wounds which are different from the neurological reactions to extreme threat? And if so, what current initiatives focus on this aspect of traumatic wounding injury to help the person reclaim the shattered sense of self and connection? There's a lot in that question.
Geez, Mel, you're putting me under pressure on an afternoon. But just back to the treatment I got, right? The mental health system worked for me. I mean, it was incredible. I had 3 psych ward admissions. Every one of them was amazing. And anyone heard of Ward 17, this psych ward in Melbourne? So it mainly treats veterans and first responders, but also a lot of the Bali bombing survivors went there. So it's a specialised PTSD unit. And it's a multidisciplinary team. So you have a psychiatrist who's responsible for your overall care. Then you have a social worker, a psychologist, a dietitian, a spiritual care worker. They all meet once a week to discuss your treatment, your progress. They all share each other's notes. The nurses are feeding information in. And you have group sessions with people in that ward who've all got PTSD, who've all been in similar sort of occupational traumatic situations. So it's this environment that is fostering healing. And it is just amazing. And I've sent a copy of my book to Mark Butler and said, this has to be the model for inpatient treatment in this country. It turned my life around. It really, and it involved my family. My wife would be called by the nurses on a regular basis. The social worker would call my wife. On my last day, the second last day of my first admission, the psychiatrist got on the phone with me. But I didn't say anything. I just sort of sat there while they had a great chat about me. It was just amazing. To go back to the question, I think that there is a huge role for spiritual care in terms of treatment when it comes to trauma. And I think, but it depends on the trauma, of course. And I think there is no one size fits all for any sort of trauma that people have suffered. And if you are dealing with someone who has suffered a one-off, and Ian's better versed to answer this than I am, but I think where someone has suffered, been through a traumatic situation where there is a moral dimension to the trauma, say in my case, then where there is another way to describe moral injury is a wound to the soul, okay? So where there is healing required, where soul repair is required, bring in the spiritual care worker, bring in the chaplain, bring in the people who can help with the soul work. Because one of the things about healing from moral injury, and there is a particular therapy which has come out of the United States called adaptive disclosure, which has been tested with veterans, and it's been used by some clinicians led by a guy called Brett Litz, who is the global expert on moral injury. And the whole point...
Sorry, just if you maybe...
Oh, yeah, sure, that's fine.
He has got an echoey voice.
Echo,
sorry.
yeah. So
bellowing. Maybe if you just move the mic a bit.
And so the thing with this adaptive disclosure therapy is that it assumes that the person is actually responsible for what happened, okay? That there is culpability. So the way it works with me, for example, with the deaths of my staff, the working assumption is that yes, I do bear some responsibility, and so that assumption then is used to. So once that's the working assumption, the idea is then, well, how do you make amends? Okay, how do you atone if you've done something that you feel deeply shameful for or guilty about? How do you make amends? How do you atone? How do you make meaning out of that experience? So this is where this adaptive disclosure differs from something like CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, which might try to persuade someone that they are thinking irrationally, or maybe it's erroneous thinking, or that they're overly negative. Because the whole thing with, if you look at, say, veterans who come back or first responders, they are faced with situations where they have to make very difficult decisions, and sometimes those decisions might not be completely within their control, but they do feel a sense of responsibility over what happens. And the last thing people want is for someone to say to them, it was the fog of war, or don't blame yourself, right? That is just doesn't help anyone. So this adaptive disclosure treatment is I think it's very interesting. I used elements of it through the healing of myself, through the Ward 17 psych ward. But at the stage, all the treatments for moral injury are very embryonic. I mean, moral injury is not classified as a mental illness. It's not part of the DSM. Book is it might be part of the DSM-6, but that I still think is a long way off.
So I might just comment about that, because I think what Dean's alluded to also is context matters. So who develops PTSD is much, much more complicated than just being exposed to a life-threatening event or something happening. So I think one of the problems, in fact, with the whole notion is people who almost come to the assumption that if you've been exposed to something and it's bad, then the chances that you'll get PTSD are very high. In fact, that's not true. The great majority of humans who are exposed to events that might be linked to actually don't get PTSD. They may have an acute response to the kind of event, but they recover. I mean, what's remarkable about humans, most of us, it's not remarkable that we get destabilised, we get distressed, we get upset. What's remarkable is the extent to which we recover from those events. So what becomes really interesting in these areas is, why don't people recover? What is the circumstances? Now, one I alluded to earlier on has got to do with repeated exposure. So what we see in our veterans, we see in first responders, there's a whole repeated exposure. It hasn't just happened once. I mean, even Dean's alluded to the number of things that he had dealt with over a long period of time. We know this from, and this becomes a management issue, management in our veterans and management of people in organisations that have a responsibility. As Angus Houston used to say about our Defence Forces, we take young people from the community, then we put them in harm's way. Right? We have a responsibility in this area as to how we manage that. A lot of discussion about Australia's SAS forces in Afghanistan, etc., is repeatedly sending the same people back again and again and again, and assuming that they would be immune for it because they're kind of all warrior class people and nothing would go wrong. I think we've seen how much things did go wrong. So there's a lot of other things. Another is the social context. So why moral injuries become really important is, what was the organisation doing? What was the degree of support? What sat around people? Now, basically, humans are social animals, so we all cope better with adversity as part of coherent and organised social groups with strong collective kind of responses. So even though we're doing difficult things or facing difficult threats, if you're strongly connected, so there are a lot of other factors at work. I think the moral injury ones are arisen much, much more around what were organisations doing, what were social groups doing. That wasn't just the exposure that happened, but the social context in which that occurred. Degrees of culpability, responsibility, or protection, who had responsibility to do things. And you see this clearly also then, as we went into earlier on, intrafamilial kind of arrangements. Who's done harm to whom? You know, what are the other sets of issues that are at stake that explain why, or help to explain why this has become such a mental health problem, that go beyond just being exposed to the risk itself. And that then deals with the complexity, which Dean has alluded to, and therefore in treatment, needing to not have a one-size-fits-all. So the other comment about treatment, Dean's talked about the upside, which is great. It's great to know that somebody does get good mental health care. Unfortunately, in Australia, for many complex problems, that's not the case. And so this is one of those areas where I think the story that Dean's telling us is great, where specialist care, it's smart care, it's multidisciplinary, it takes into account spiritual and moral dimensions as well, psychological dimensions, works. Unfortunately, the great majority of people who find themselves in this situation never get to that kind of personalised and expert care. And the problem tends to be then perpetuated by poor care, poor experiences of care, and ongoing then chronicity, and what people do to cope. Alcohol, other substances, other things that happen. And the breakdown then in their social environments, breakdown in marriages, breakdown in families, breakdown in communities as a consequence of not receiving early and effective intervention for the problem.
Yeah. I mean, could the sort of treatment that Dean received, I mean, it was very specialist, it was very much, it was sort of occupied for people who had suffered for PTSD who had in the workplace or workforce or as veterans, or could that be replicated to other, to other people who, like refugees who come from war treatments for refugees who come from war-torn countries, or survivors of sexual abuse?
Yes, but to pick up a point that Vivian was making earlier on, there's also a collective aspect of this. So it's not just you on your own. So you see this with veterans and support amongst mates groups in veterans returned and other things, is that unless there's often a collective element to it as well, the sharing of experiences of people, the reconnecting with communities that are part of, who really understand the nature of what has happened. So that may well happen with survivors of sexual abuse, who really understand experiences the rest of people do not understand, or who come from a culture who understand what has taken place, or understand what took place in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in other areas. So there's a whole other set of issues about not just what can be replicated personally, but the extent to which you can draw on social resources and collective resources that assist in that whole process. So to pick up Dean's comment here about multidimensionality, there are many dimensions to be considered, not just what could be done for individuals who find themselves individually in that situation. And I think, our systems are not good at that. Most of our healthcare and most of our mental health care is very individually focused, individually funded, individually supported. And you see from groups, our own war veterans would be one of the best examples, but refugee groups are other examples. Hang on a second, there's something fundamentally missing here in not really understanding. Many of the people that are asked to provide the treatment and really have no understanding really of the situation in which people have found themselves. They just really can't relate to it.
Yeah. Great. Look, I think we'll... actually, there's one more, and that was related, I think, where Ian, you were talking about, people who turn to drink and, the family breakdowns. So there's a question here from someone who's registered. Often those impacted by trauma or PTSD, for example, soldiers, veterans, frontline workers, are prone to extreme behaviours, including aggression, drinking, sexual or gender-based violence. What provokes this? I'll start with you, Ian.
Well, rather than saying what provokes it, what I'm saying is it's the perpetuation of it. Okay, I mean, in a sense, I'm not saying it provoked. It's a continuation of not resolving these kind of issues. So you see a complexity, you see it get worse, you see transgenerational effects, etc. So you just see, in a sense, this sort of totally pernicious effect of violence and its effect on others being played out by people who are themselves greatly distressed. But rather than just internalising that process, it's played out in domestic and other relationships very poorly. So rather than saying it's provoked, I'd say a failure to deal with the issues in the first place. You see the extension of that to having its impact on many others.
Dean, you've written about this and your own kind of, that you're
Yes.
kind of guilty, well, not guilty, I don't know if that's the right word, but certainly that's something that the drinking,
I think I can speak from the experience of being an angry man with PTSD in a house where for my family were walking on eggshells for years, and that was terrifying for them because of that sense that any unexpected noise would set me off. Dropping of a plate, slamming of a door, something being said the wrong way, and it was the result of that. What the injury does, what the PTSD does, is that you're on a hair trigger. You can be so agitated. Your whole nervous system is just completely overworked, and you just sort of lose control over your emotions, and it's a nightmare for family. I mean, I'm very lucky that my family is still together, and I've had to work through a lot of that. And I know from my experience of the psych ward that a lot of relationships have not survived the anger. And I think it's probably the most destructive of the symptoms when it comes to, especially from men, is the anger. That's what has destroyed a lot of relationships. And it's something that we would talk a lot about in the psych ward, and a lot of men were very open about their anger and they wanted to deal with it. But a lot of the times, I think it was hard to deal with because overriding a lot of their anger was a sense of betrayal. And you know, Ian was talking about this. It was the sense of being betrayed by their country, by their organisation, being this sort of sense that they'd been abandoned. And if you've a soldier that served your country or a copper that served your community for a long time and then you're left on the scrap heap and thrown into workers' compensation hell, it just didn't leave much left for some of these men, stripped of their identities. And that's where I think a lot of the anger came from, because for them, they had really nothing, there was no meaning in their lives. And I'm not condoning the anger at all. I mean, I was angry myself, but I think it just maybe helps explain it a little bit.
Can I add something?
Sure.
I think also the capacity, Ian mentioned it's the responsibility, that if organizations and individuals don't have much ability to respond to when trauma, like anger, erupts, then how, as a society, can we build more ability to respond, to ability, I mean, we talk about compassion, solidarity, and so on, to be able to respond about what is happening. I think one of the things when I read this book was if there is the society that tends to soldier on to, you know, let's get on with and forget about, or the society that equals weakness with actually vulnerability, then also that narrative is not responsible in a way as a society, because when things comes up as a group, or then there is this isolation, not just from the organizations, but in general, from the mindset. Because then it's, okay, I'm alone, because there is not understood that there is this association with. So my question is, maybe to how can we enlarge this capacity, to be responsible? Like, how, as a society, can we build that capacity to actually hold a bit more and be able to see the other in that disruption? Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's great answers, everyone. I'm going to open the floor to questions from the audience. I think the first one, the man in the middle, yeah.
Thank you very much for this very informative session. My question is, can one generation inherit the trauma of a previous generation? And while they as well as living in a new trauma and the impact that might have on the subsequent generations?
Yeah, so the state of research at the moment, the simple answer is yes. How, and how is it ameliorated, and how is it actually transmitted, remains a matter of considerable ongoing debate. But I think one of the really good things, actually, in the last 20 or 30 years is the recognition of transgenerational effects. So just because the people affected are no longer in the situation, to assume that the war is over, the conflict's over, no one is affected further, particularly within their own families. There's a lot of debate about how that happens behaviourally, extent to which it may happen genetically, are there epigenetic effects that are actually passed from one generation to another, and it's a good deal of accumulating evidence about that and the extent to which that may occur. But the bottom line of it is yes. Now, what we could do to change it, but the trouble with that is, in a lot of these areas, that people then think there's nothing that can be done. So the so-called, both the behavioural effects and then the epigenetic effects, the assumption about all those things is also that they are reversible. That the way in which really fascinating, I think, the way in which these experiences come to be encoded within our own nervous systems, our own responses, how that happens. The other side of that coin in the neuroscience area is a very optimistic one, the extent to which those things can change back again, that they're not fixed. And that includes within changes within the genetic code that may be passed from one generation to the next, or the way in which other experiences are passed from familiar things. So I think the tension here is between recognising that that is the case and being able to record that, but not assuming that it's deterministic, not assuming there's nothing that can be done about that to ameliorate those effects. I think the thing is the awareness of it needs to say, okay, the risk here is considerable, it's ongoing, and it's potentially transmissible across generations. So what do we do? What can we do to ameliorate those effects? And I think that's where the awareness of the nature of the problems and then much more a focus on actually trying to prevent those problems actually occurring in the next generation or across generations is focus. And this is, let's say, this is what I really like about the work in Colombia. They recognise that as a nation. So unlike our First Nations kind of things, we keep pretending it didn't happen. They go, it has happened, and we can see the effects across generations. So what are we going to do about it? It's being played out now in second and third generations from a period of considerable national trauma. So it's really interesting. Their awareness is from the president down, previous president down, to say, we're going to make a difference about this. We're not just going to allow it to keep going. And it's difficult because there are many other social factors that they're dealing with concurrently, which make it hard.
We'll try here, then we'll go to you, Jake, after.
Thank you so much for your talks and experience. I have a question, I think particularly for Dean. Your experience with trauma very much from a work-based organisational setting. And so I have worked in certain situations where I've definitely experienced trauma, and I found it quite difficult to try and explain to leadership this work can actually provide trauma to people, especially if it's not in very typical settings, like you're not the first responder as a police officer or something. And I know that on your CV, I think I read somewhere around mental health for media, a role in the media. How do you think that we can get organisations to be thinking about and actually putting in place protective mechanisms for specialised groups of people, like researchers, like journalists, people who are actually, their job is to look at, to find traumatic things, and how can we have preventative things in place?
That's a great question, and there is actually legislation that's been passed nationally. Psychosocial hazard legislation, right, that is now in effect, that all workplaces need to be cognizant of the mental health of their employees across the board. But then someone said to me, I'll wait till someone goes to jail, right? So that's what you're dealing with organisations, is bureaucratic inertia when it comes to actually putting in place the sort of policies that are required. So I was the head of mental health at Reuters for 3 years before I left. I was actually tasked with creating a mental health strategy for 2,500 journalists around the world. It was actually easier running the Baghdad bureau at the height of the Iraq War. I kid you not, right? Because of bureaucratic resistance, because of leadership that didn't want me in the newsrooms saying journalists are overworked, journalists are suffering burnout. They were fine with me talking about journalists who were suffering from PTSD from war zone coverage. That's okay. Yeah, that's fine. But let's not talk about 16-hour days. Yeah? So the challenge, I think, and I do work with organisations on mental health, and I tend to be a little bit rough, right? I basically say, is the way you're operating harming your staff? Simple as that. Let's forget fruit bowls and yoga mats. Okay? Is the way you are operating harming the mental health of your staff? And if so, what have you got to do to change it? Okay? And there are so many different ways that staff their mental health can be harmed. Research, right, that involves any sort of traumatic material. It's vicarious trauma, okay? You don't have to be a copper to experience trauma, okay? So you just need to present to your organisation the research around vicarious trauma, and there's actually quite a bit out there on this topic, to do with journalists, to do with actually there's a well-known case from last year involving a solicitor who worked in the sex crimes unit of the Victorian prosecution unit, who took her case to the High Court and won, okay, which now sets a legal precedent for vicarious trauma, that organisations are on notice when it comes to this sort of thing. So it's just, I think the key is to make your organisations aware that this sort of material or this sort of work has a traumatic component, make HR aware, and make them aware that it has an impact, and it's that they need the training, that they need the policies in place, and that this is 2023, right? And don't give up.
Great. Well, Vivian has done some, you've referred to the work that you do as a researcher, as an active researcher, and the impacts on that in countries like, Peru in your case. Would you like to expand on that question?
Yeah, I think, I've been in a journey of, I'm part of a group called Timeless Wisdom Training for the last 3 years, also for my own healing, but also to actually know more, because as I said before, I want to have more room within myself to actually take, more. I just got fascinated about the job of collective healing and the work of this organization where I'm doing the Pocket Project and Timeless Wisdom Training. So, but then doing this work, I realized, I thought, okay, I don't remember having a particular trauma. And then I thought, okay, I was a refugee case worker in Amnesty. I did live in Peru during the armed conflict, but I thought I was on the best side, let's say. I didn't live in the highlands, but I do remember going to university and saw a bomb exploding. And I thought, maybe I was numb. And then going back, and then I thought, okay, I watched structural poverty growing up as well, and so on. So that journey, and then to realize that everybody has kind of like this exposure somehow, but not digested, or this witnessing, or from other, we talk about intergenerational trauma, like what my father went through, or my mother, and then I thought, wow, this is really a fragmented world, and how then I created a space on me so I am a contemplative practitioner now, and I increased my meditation 2 months ago to 2 hours, so I'm happy. But I think in a way, finding this fragmentation also made me more in compassion and in solidarity with other people, and to acknowledge that the journey. So I think for many people will be that, I haven't experienced anything, but because I'm in this 3-year journey, we unpacked since before, like this very intensive journey. So yes, I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think we have time for one more. Jake, have you got a big voice, Jake, or do you need the?
Sorry, so another one. I feel I should name the elephant in the room. I mean, frankly, the reason why Julian Assange is behind bars because he revealed to the world the video from the helicopter cockpit where your colleagues were killed. And the reason for that is because that video reveals something fundamental about the nature of US military action committing colossal war crime in Iraq. So how do you feel, and how does it affect prospects for healing? You see Australia still cozying up to that US war machine, even to the point of the AUKUS submarine deal.
I wasn't expecting to get a question.
No, well, that's why I went to.
Peace Foundation.
So Jake used to be the director of the Sydney Peace Foundation, or Peace and Conflict Studies.
Right, no,
Yeah.
that's...
Thank
Thank you for the question, Jake. And of course, I've been campaigning for Julian's release for some time now, and that footage, the collateral murder tape, showed the world what the war in Iraq really looked like. And it is a very, very powerful piece of journalism, and it was journalism. What people might not realise is that when WikiLeaks got that tape from Chelsea Manning, one of the first things that Julian did was he sent people from WikiLeaks to Baghdad to find the two kiddies who were in that minivan. He wanted to verify that this tape was real. And so by doing that, he sent two people from WikiLeaks to Iraq, and they actually used the Reuters office as a bit of a go-between to find the two kids who were in that minivan, to help confirm the authenticity of that tape. So when people tell you that Julian is not a journalist, you can tell them that little backstory of the tape. I find this whole question of our insipid response to Julian's incarceration very hard to stomach, because at the end of the day, not a single US military or civilian official has ever been held accountable for the invasion of Iraq, for the reckless invasion, for the occupation of Iraq, for the countless loss of life in Iraq, for the destruction of Iraq and its people. And yet Julian Assange is being persecuted over the publication of what were the facts of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And for this whole thing to have been turned on its head like that just boggles my mind. And I think as a society, when we are willing to let someone like that particular individual who told the truth the way he told the truth, then we are allowing our institutions to be completely corrupted. And having spent a lot of time in Iraq, having spent a lot of time in Vietnam, I was a young bureau chief for Reuters in Vietnam in the late 90s, another conflict that was illegal and that resulted in the great destruction of a country. I don't think we should be getting into bed with the United States over anything to do with security. So I just find it unfathomable, to be honest.
The next talk will be on around Julian Assange. Now it is 5:30, and I do realise that we can take one more. Does two people mind staying for just a section? Yeah. We might not have time for that. I think, because that's a lot in the Thomas Hugel stuff. Sorry, it's 5:30. Yeah. Look, it is important. Maybe, yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, if I can say,
Okay.
I think, Ian was mentioning about the collective and how, different groups needs to heal in a collective way. Needs in a way that we know one-to-one therapy is expensive, and the treatment to receive if everybody, so collectively it's a way to meet with experiences, with people that experiences similar exposure to trauma, and collectively also is trauma isolate us, separate, and collectively healing is in relation. So healing can happen in relation to one another and be able to see to one another that number of sessions to exposure to more of that, as we know the level of exposure and how many times someone is exposed to situation in which the experience is split matters. So same as if healing in terms of meeting, group of people, talking about it, and opening the space to see each other in that safe environment, safety first. It's essential, and that's some of the job that Thomas does.
Vivian has got a book coming out at the end of the year, so where I think you touch on these issues.
I talk about what is the biggest threat in war. My finding is fragmentation of society and the self, and knowing that is coming the new agenda for peace by the UN for the next summit of the future for the Security Council for next year. So I think it's important they are finding out what are the threats, climate change and so on. I think the biggest threat is this one.
Okay. Look, it is well past 5:30. I just would like one word or a sentence from all of you, just to sum it up, and so people have something to take home. What is the most effective, one or two effective strategies for survivors of war and conflict to heal from the trauma and navigate crises and start contributing to a more positive society? I mean, I think storytelling was one thing that...
So if my book's called Line in the Sand, if it wasn't called Line in the Sand, I would have called it Human Connection, right? But then that wouldn't have sold. But this is what we've been talking about, right? We've been talking about societies, we've been talking about collective, we've been talking about...
So,
just old habit.
Human
connection. Human connection. I think that is so important when it comes to healing. You can't do it on your own. And if you can connect with people, then it just makes it, that journey is possible.
Ian?
So I think we've all emphasised that kind of thing about the combination of factors. I just emphasise, unfortunately, in our own setting, lots of people get nowhere near anything that would help. So if you are frustrated by trying to seek help, you're frustrated by what has happened, probably need to stick at it and connect with groups who know more about where you could receive effective care.
Yeah. And Viviana, is there a word, 2 words, a sentence?
I think it's not one fits all, but I think listening with the heart when other one is saying something, it's
Great. Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming along. I'll just, on September 11th, very auspicious, on Australian Story, Dean and his family feature on Australian Story, if you'd like to catch up and find out. I know. Can you believe it? Yeah, I know. Amazing, huh? And of course, Ian has his wonderful book, Minding Your Mind. And Viviana's book, as I mentioned, is coming out. And there's Dean's book, Line in the Sand. If you haven't read it, it's a captivating read, a bit disturbing in parts. And also the Peace Foundation has its 2nd volume of Conversations in Peace, which is also available, which features the addresses of the Peace Prize winners for the past 10 years. And Jane actually has a few here if you'd like to buy some, but it will be available online as well. So thank you, everyone. And this session should be recorded, hopefully, if the university systems work. And to everybody who's registered, they'll get a recording, and we'll also have it up on our website. Sorry. It's fine. Yeah, it's fine. It's too bad. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. That was great. Thank you.